So the first question I'm going to ask is, so you've just gone on bypass, you've cross-clamped and arrested the heart, and the perfusionist tells you the line pressure is high and you cannot achieve full bypass. What should you do? Options. 1, instruct the perfusionist to come off bypass and remove the clamp. Ask an anesthesiologist to perform a TE to look for a dissection. Manipulate the arterial cannula. Ask the perfusionist to come down to half flow and cannulate the patient peripherally. Ask the perfusionist to reduce the flow and manipulate the arterial cannula.
At this point, was the line pressure were okay beforehand?
Yeah.
Line pressure was fine.
Yeah, everything was fine beforehand. You've done all your checks when you cannulate.
And you give them cardiopulmonary.
Yeah, you've cross-clamped the heart, you know, in the pressure. Right? No, you've cross-clamped the heart.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, let's.
I will uncross the aorta and recheck again the pressures. There's a way to.
But you cannulated, you've checked the pressure, he's given you a good feedback, you gave a test dose, everything was fine. And now you go on pump and suddenly, what happens when you go on pump?
Well, when you go on pump, you pretty much run the flow at 60s, 70s. And, but this is before or after cross-clamping?
Cross-clamp. So the question is, you've cross-clamped the heart.
Okay.
You start the procedure to tell you the line pressure is high.
Line pressure is high, okay. I want to make sure that the cross-clamping is done properly all the way, and I don't have any problems with the technical aspect.
Okay.
I'll recheck again.
All right.
I have to check the.
All right. In the interest of time, we'll talk about this later. So I'll give you one more question. Then this is a basic question. So talk about pump setup. Steve, since you're the most senior person, in the arrangement of the pump, is the oxygenator before the heater cooler or after the heater cooler?
Forward.
It's before the heater cooler. Okay. Any other answers? Shinobu.
I'm not sure.
Okay. What happens when you heat blood?
Please.
So the oxygenator should be before or after the cooler, the heater cooler? After, right? That makes the most practical sense. Okay. All right. So we established one thing. You guys know the pump. All right. So we'll just move along with the talk, and I'll keep asking questions at certain points. Okay. So I have no disclosures. And this talk basically covers the basics of cardiopulmonary bypass. We'll get into a bit of the history, which thankfully I got some education myself after talking to one of our applicants this past weekend. I got very educated about the history of cardio bypass and how we come to enjoy the freedom that we have today to do what we do on a daily basis without thinking much about it. It's a very critical part of our specialty. It's basically the flagship of what we do, and that's what separates us from other surgeons. No other surgery uses a pump. Yet we take it for granted because surgery is done so effortlessly these days that it's not something that we think about and we just say, go on pump, come off pump, give this, give that, without really thinking about the critical steps. Heart surgery, a lot of urban legends, biblical truths, folklore, perceived reality, crushing defeats, and Olympian successes. When you think of heart surgery, I guess anybody would say the first person to close a PDA was
Robert Gross.
Robert Gross, okay. A gentleman called Strider, 15 months before that, closed a PDA. Unfortunately, his patient died from endocarditis, which is a presented symptom. So that's one of the folklores, okay? We know about all the successes of all the pioneers of heart surgery. If I was to ask anybody who did the first successful heart surgery.
Bernard. In the world, but Chamois in the United States.
Heart surgery, open heart surgery.
Oh, I'm sorry, open heart, sorry.
Who did the first successful open heart surgery?
Open heart surgery.
Is open heart on bypass or not?
Check one. It's on bypass.
But
Yeah.
On bypass.
Here.
The Swedish ASD case.
So successful means the patient actually went through the procedure and lived and everything was okay, right?
John
That's
Gibbon.
the big.
So everybody talks about Gibbon, right? Gibbon was the first person everybody knows. You know, he had a full bypass. And the reason he's talked about is because he was the one to use both the pump and an oxygenator, and the patient actually survived. But there were several instances before then that things were being done, and the patients actually survived, and no one really talks about it. Things that I didn't know and I discovered myself, okay? He had one success, we all know about it. 5 of his other patients all died. He gave up heart surgery altogether and just did thoracic surgery for the rest of his life. So that's some of the crushing defeats. But with this persistence, we enjoy this freedom to run the pump every day. Had he given up, we wouldn't have been where we are today, because all the other people who delved into this surely probably gave up at some point. So this is a pump. This is what a pump looks like for those who have not been in the OR. A very complex machine drilled down to very fine components. You see here, you have the roller heads pumps. These are the auxiliary pumps. And this is a new MPS system. But this is the oxygenator venous reservoir composition, basically. And then you have a centrifugal pump with a centrifugal head over here. This, I'll show you as time goes on. This is what this main system, the oxygenator and the heater cooler system, was what retarded the progress of cardiac surgery. Pumps were always available. Pumps had been available in the industry. Pumps were available, so pumps was not the problem. The big, you had pumps before oxygenators were available. The issue was oxygenation, how to properly oxygenate patients. And a lot of work went into this, and it took several years for people to get through. So just to walk through for people who are not familiar with the pump, you have the heart, blood comes back, is drained from the right side of the heart into a venous reservoir that allows you to add fluids, medications, gets bits of air. It goes through a heater cooler, and then it gets oxygenated and it goes back to the patient to the arterial line. This is a simplified diagram, a little more complex than that, but it sort of shows you how the system works. Bypass is safe. I mean, we do it so effortlessly these days. It's estimated about almost, if you don't what you read, about 500 to 1 million cases a year are done. The risk is extremely low, about 1%, and it's done with very little thought. While it's done safely and people survive, you can also have catastrophes. We know about them. The most feared ones are aortic dissections, massive air embolus, and they are minor things that are annoyance, but can also cause significant morbidity and harm. In the 1950s, as we said, there's a lot of courageous people persisted. When you think about what they did, everything was based on the surgeon's conscience. There was no IRB. If you thought you could do it, you just did it. And there was no checks and balances. A lot of things were not reported because there was no one reporting them. Those who reported their successes, and a lot of people got away with doing many things. It's even repeated like Kirkland, when he tried to do his first series of surgeries, had 8 patients lined up for surgery. And he planned to do all 8, even if all of them died. There was no question he was going to move forward. Thankfully, not all 8 died. 4 of them survived, so he moved forward with that. There's a lot of unsung heroes in our history that put down their cats, dogs, and monkeys. They were instrumental in the quite supportive cast that helped us achieve success in cardiopulmonary bypass. And I'll show you some images of that. So what can go wrong when you're on the pump? Many things. Almost everything can go wrong. The pump can fail. The heater cooler can fail. Proton reactions are a problem, depending on which ones we have. The oxygenator can fail, electrical failure, massive air embolism we talked about, inadequate oxygenation, dissections, cannula dislodgement. The gas supply can fail, and miscellaneous things can happen where people knock off the oxygenator when they're walking by. So all these are things that people have talked about in the past that we took for granted, that just walking by the oxygenator, you can kick it and knock it off and create a catastrophe in the operating room. So people have looked at, perfusion safety to see what are the issues. A lot of surveys were done starting from the 70s through the 80s through the 2000s. These are multiple surveys that covered multiple periods of time as perfusion safety and perfusion techniques evolved. You can see Stoney, Wilden, Cruz. Some of these were of cardiac surgeons. Most of these were for perfusion surveys. The response rate was low. However, it gave a snapshot of what was going on at the time. The event rate, you can see, is about 1 in 300 cases. But the ones that actually cause morbidity and mortality is about 1 in 1,000. That's like a 0.1% of major morbidity and mortality. So it's low, but it's still significant. It's significant for the patient and for the population that gets affected. If you look down here, the things that vexed surgeons and everybody was air embolism in the beginning, DIC. It's unthinkable that today you can do cases without ACT. Back then it was almost routine. People, you thought it was routine, but people didn't do it. They didn't check ACTs routinely. You just run the pump, gave as much heparin as you needed, and thought it was okay. Inadequate perfusion, almost unthinkable to not flow people appropriately. And as time went on, as safety measures were added and people got more smart about this, air embolism became less important. Other things came up, failures of the pump, and then coagulation disorders and heterocolius became much more important in the 2000s. If you look at the incidence, again, it's quite low, and it kept dropping. So this is percent on this side, so 0.1% in 1980, and down to about 0.8% in 2000. So the rates of adverse outcomes, these are things that are really bad that happen to people dying, prolonged output stay, difficulty living their lives post-bypass. What was changed, people added many features. Arterial filters, as you can tell, changed based on which survey you looked at. But clearly, the trend was much more used as you went towards the 2000s. Again, blood level sensors, which we take for granted, that can actually tell where the reservoir level is and can actually stop the pump these days, which are automatic stoppages, were not available all the time. And if they were, people were not using them routinely, uniformly. Air bubble detectors, again, one thing we take for granted in pump. You can tell, again, was not used uniformly, and as time went on, it became much more prevalent. Pre-bypass checklists, things that we do so, without even thinking, was not available. And most people just came up with the information on their own. Most proficients say, I know what is in my head, I know what to do, and we'll miss a step. But they were the proficients, you couldn't question them, and you didn't know how to run the pump, as Ahmed was asking earlier. So they did their thing, and people had catastrophes by missing simple steps. If you look at this as the safety devices based on time, 1989 and 1994, clearly people became more knowledgeable as information was disseminated about how to take patients through bypass and do it safely. So how has safety been improved? These days we have pre-bypass checklists, preventive maintenance, alarms. And these alarms, low venous level alarms, air, high arterial line pressures, and microbubble detectors have been set so they're almost automatic. You don't even have to think about it. If it happens, the pump will just shut off, which is a big safety measure that we didn't have back in the early days of surgery. I'm sure Dr. Stelzer can account to some of these events. Arterial line filters are now commonplace. They're using everything. One-way pressure relief valves, backup generators. People didn't have generators in the hospital. If the power shut off, you were out up a creek without a paddle. Oxygen supply, all these things are features that have been added that's made cardiopulmonary bypass safer. And how have we maintained this despite all this? By using quality improvement processes, M&Ms, debriefs have helped maintain these effective processes. The checklists I talked about, drills, crisis simulation, what happens if this happens, what would you do, who would do what, all important. Formal training of perfusionists, it used to be they were just trained on the job. You just took the job and you became part of the team and did perfusion. Protocols that are basically in place to prevent variances, so people do the same thing all the time without thinking about it. And then you have to reevaluate, the four principles of a process is, identification, evaluation, resolution, and then reassessment. Just by doing well doesn't mean you're good all the time. We've heard Dr. Swain talk many times about assessing our, reassessing our processes to make sure we're doing the best job we can. Even though we're better than average, we still want to be better and get better. Then emergent conformance, teamwork, effective communication, and then of course, technology has made it easier for bypass surgery to be extremely safe these days. Recently, a paper that was published looking at residents in training, specifically looking at how the reduced hours is affecting residents' proficiency. This is from the UK. They did simulation for one group, and then they did actual formal teaching for an hour. And then they had them take a pre and post test. Clearly, they show that simulation helps, and it's almost equal. So you can take residents to a lectures like this and just talk about the bad things that can happen, not just having to do practice simulation. So this is one more thing that people have been doing and need to keep doing to improve proficiency and keep us on the cutting edge with surgery and bypass surgery. So we'll switch gears for a little bit and go back in history to look at how we got here. On the left, you have the Gibbon 2 pump that was designed by him and IBM. It was joked that it looked more like a punch card machine of the early computers. And on the right is mainly the whole system that we've used that they developed to come up to what we have today. Centrifugal pump head, the magnetic coupling system, the oxygenator, and the heater cooler system all in one unit, which is actually disposable. This is all disposable. This was a nightmare to move around. This was 2,000 pounds or more, and it had to be cleaned and sterilized for each case. And you can imagine the work it took just to get this ready. Again, a lot of people saw this pump, and for instance, Cooley, Denton Cooley, he went to visit, this was happening in Minnesota and Philadelphia and other places. When Cooley visited Kirkland and saw what they were doing, and visited a Gibbon and saw what he was doing, then he went to Minnesota and saw what Lilly High and his group were doing. Lilly High's system was very simple oxygenation system as opposed to this complex thing that required a whole bunch of engineers. So guess which one he took back to Texas? He took the Lilly High system, which was a helix bubble oxygenator. And that actually became the standard of oxygenation for several years until the membrane oxygenator was developed, and that became a much more acceptable standard. So I have a few quotes in here because I thought this was interesting stuff. We can all learn a little bit today. So this is Lilly High standing by his oxygenator. So he says, a physician at the bedside of a child dying of an intracardiac malformation as recently as 1952 could only pray for recovery. Now with a heart lung machine, correction is routine. Just 40 years ago, the outer wall of the living human heart was presented with an impenetrable anatomic barrier to the surgeon's knife. Think about that for a minute. We do this so effortlessly. We don't even think about that. So what plagued our forefathers? A lot of high-risk surgery that we take for granted. Most of the history of heart surgery was based on congenital malformations and fixing anomalies. That's how we started. CABGs came much later. So think of a transposition of the great arteries. There was no imaging then. A cardiac cath was a big ordeal to get a cath for any patient, much more a kid. Now the anatomy was not clear. People were learning on the job. There was no, textbooks to teach you how to do a tricuspid atresia repair. Myocardial protection was not available. Embolism, again, is one of the focus of this talk, was rampant. I mean, it killed a lot of patients. Diagnosis was oftentimes wrong. Gibbon's first case, which is reported, the patient died because he went to the OR thinking the patient had a ASD. The patient ended up having a PDA. And the flow was so torrential he couldn't see. The patient died from exsanguination and wrong diagnosis. Likewise, Dennis, who did his first operation, went to the OR thinking he was going to close an ASD. The patient had an AV canal defect, so much blood flow he couldn't see. The patient died from a combination of exsanguination and him creating tricuspid stenosis, trying to close this hole by the tricuspid valve with an AV canal defect. So just think of that in context of what we do today. It's almost unthinkable that you could get away with that. Bleeding was a problem, a lot of DIC. We take all that for granted. Flow rates were astronomical. The prevailing thought then was that to perfuse a human, you needed a flow of 100 cc's to 165 cc's per kilo per minute. That means that a 70 kilo person would need 7 liters of flow. This whole idea of hypothermia and less flow was not prevalent then. So just imagine a little baby going through surgery, and it's just unthinkable how these people got through. There were no ICUs. A simple blood gas not available. We don't have it. If you wanted a Chem 7, it takes 4 to 5 hours to get like 3 or 4 elements out of that Chem 7. Just put that in context of what we do today. Stat Labs comes back in 30 minutes and we start screaming. They had none of that. No monitoring, no pacemakers. None of that was available then. But somehow they persevered. If you look farther back in history, perfusion was not a problem. People knew that you could perfuse organs and get them to work. Legalio showed that you can take organs from dead animals and perfuse them with oxygenated blood, and the organs will work out of the body. Brown's Accord showed that if you took the muscles of guillotined prisoners and infused them with their own oxygenated blood, the rigor mortis would go away. Interesting finding back then. Max von Frey and Max Gruber developed a filament technique to oxygenate blood. So that was known then, as far back in the 1800s. The question is how to get that oxygenated blood into the patient safely was a big issue. No one knew how to do that. There were no deforming agents. We don't even think of deforming agents these days. So infusing the oxygen into blood, bubbling it, created a lot of foam, and we know what air embolism does. So a lot of people died, a lot of experiments went awry. Heparin was discovered in 1915 by J. McLean. He was working in the lab of Howell and Johns Hopkins. And the story goes that he was supposed to be looking for antithrombin. And as legend has it, he was doing these extractions and he got this compound out of the liver and heparin, hepatophospholipid or something like that, I think was the right word. And he took it to his boss and said, look, I found antithrombin. And he goes, wait a minute, there's no antithrombin. Antithrombin is, a protein. You're working with, phospholipids. It cannot be. And the guy goes, yes, I did find it. It says, well, are you sure you didn't contaminate your sample with some salts and other things from your bench? Again, skepticism. So he said, fine. So he called one of the guys who were working and had him bleed a cat into a beaker and then mixed it with his extract and left it on his desk and said, watch and see if it clots. So as we know, it never clotted. So that's how heparin was discovered. So heparin was available then, but they didn't know how to use it and then what doses to use for bypass. For those of you who've heard of these two Russians, Brukhanenko and Tekchulin, they have these dramatic videos of dogs' heads that have been guillotined and the carotids being infused with oxygenated blood, and the dog head is still working with no body. Dramatic stuff in the 1920s. And they used another dog's lungs as the oxygenator to provide oxygen because no one knew how to do that. There was no way to use oxygenated blood. Charles Lindbergh's family member who was diagnosed with a terminal lung cardiac disease kept asking the question, I think it was a sister-in-law has this terminal disease. She's been prescribed 1 year of bed rest. Is there a way to take over the heart function? And that got him, spurred into discussion with Carrel. Carrel discouraged him from doing much more than developing pumps. So they came up with all these pumps that could perfuse tissues for up to 18 days, even the thyroid tissue, and then regenerate culture from the cells, showing that the cells were still living even after 18 days of perfusion. Insteps and Gibbon, which we all talk about, he started his research after 1930. And in 1937, he actually had his first success in the lab, being able to bypass the lungs of dogs. And this was a celebration for him. And then from 1937, unfortunately, the war started in 1939, World War II. He went to war. But while he was gone, other people took over. And he came back from war. And thankfully, he was now a professor at Temple University. One of the medical students who was a friend of his was a friend of James Watson at IBM. Gibbon didn't have any sponsors. He didn't have any funding. He was doing this all as the mom and pop shop in his basement. So this chance meeting between him and IBM was like the pinnacle of his experiments. And suddenly he had engineers and everybody could work for him and create actual working pumps without him struggling. At the same time Gibbon was doing this, we have Crawford in Stockholm who did the first coarctation repair. He was also developing pumps. Jongbloed in Utrecht in Holland was also developing pumps. Dennis was told by Wagenstein in Minnesota to develop a pump to do heart surgery. And he borrowed from Crawford's pump system to do heart surgery. His first surgery was a planned ASD closure, which I talked about. The patient ended up with tricuspid stenosis and then died. His second surgery was successful, actually. But at the end of the case, the patient got pumped with air. And the patient died immediately in the operating room. So air embolism has been around for a while, and this is something we deal with now. To talk about the Italians, De Glorti in Turin, he also developed a pump, but was never used in any other cases except for to assist the patient who became hypotensive during a mediastinal mass resection. The Drill in Detroit, with the help of GM, developed his own pump. So multiple people were doing pumps. So again, it's not just Gibbon. We all talk about Gibbon, this is what we know about, but a lot of pumps were being developed simultaneously. The question is which one was going to be successful and be used consistently in humans and to provide a success in outcomes. Heater cooler, Dr. Ivan Braun at Duke commissioned the Harris Radiator Division of General Motors to develop a heater cooler. So up until now, patients who needed to be cooled had to be wrapped in blankets for an hour to 2 hours before you could do the case. And then once you finished the case, you had to wait 2 to 3 hours to rewarm them. So think of the advancement and the achievement then. By 1956, bubble oxygenators were available. Cardiac surgery basically exploded. Heater coolers were available. Everybody was doing it all over the world. 1966, an assistant of Lilly Duval basically developed a disposable hard shell bubble oxygenator, which is the prototype of what we have today. And then, of course, the Medtronic centrifugal pump, 1976. But look, in the 17th century, French physicist Denis Papin had already done this. So again, this stuff has been around a long time. So Bigelow, which we all talk about, and he's known for what? Do you guys know what he's known for? Residents? Cardioplegia? Okay. Any other?
Cardioplegia, close.
I forget the extent of. Yeah, it was his first for stopping the heart.
Sorry?
His first to stop the heart for that exactly.
Okay. I guess need to do a little more reading. All right. So Bigelow, a Canadian from University of Toronto, basically everybody was worried about how to get patients through heart surgery, how to do it safely without killing people. So he came up with this idea, and again, it's always questionable. That's why I talk about urban legends and truth and all this stuff. No one knows where the idea comes from. We all borrow from other people, but he wondered why groundhogs could hibernate to 4 degrees Celsius and not die. And he said, well, can we do this in humans and get away with it? So he started the whole experiment with the groundhogs in Toronto. And in 1950, he presented this paper showing that he could cool dogs all the way to 20 degrees Celsius and open their hearts. Of course, there were problems. Some of them made it, most of them died. But that was a seminal moment in the history of cardiac surgery, that you could actually cool patients that low and get away with it and rewarm them, have them live successfully. So John Lewis took that principle in Minnesota, and he did his first case with inflow occlusion by occluding the SVC and IVC and cooling the patient down. He closed his first ASD. He had 11 cases. He closed 10 of them successfully. And of course, the problem with that was time limitation. He had only had so much time to close a defect when you're that cold, 8 or 10 minutes max, and he had to stop. So the only things he could close was ASDs and right-sided defects like pulmonary stenosis. The credit goes to Lewis, but if you read, apparently Lilly was also in there at some point. And if you read, whichever story you read, Lilly was actually the guy doing the surgery, and Lewis was the one who was helping. So I'm not sure who did what, but again, this is some of the things we've read and some of the things we felt true. And Lilly did a review of all the cases that were happening around this 1950s. And if you look at the list of cases here, it's pretty sad. Dennis had no results. Gibbon had 1 survivor after 5. Helmsworth 0. Arterial 0. Mustard and Thompson in Canada had 0. And Close 0. So everybody was dying. I mean, no one was having any success. And I'll show you one thing. Look at this. Autogenous lungs, using the patient's lungs as oxygenation. That was a big hurdle. No one could figure out how to oxygenate patients safely. Monkey lungs in Canada. They were using rhesus monkeys, $40 a piece. They take the lungs and use them as the source of oxygenation for patients. So, and then bubble oxygenator basically came onto the scene in the mid-1950s. In steps Lilly, who is given credit as the father of cardiac surgery for all the things he did. Everybody was closing simple defects. He was the first guy to actually be able to close VSDs, do a complete TET repair. And this principle was basically inflow, cross circulation. And this came out of what we call the Azygous flow concept. Before Lilly tremendous achievement, it was assumed that you could not flow patients more than what we talked about, 7 at 100 cc's per kilo at a minimum. In his lab, they realized that if they occluded both the SVC and IVC and left just the azygous vein open, the patients on pneumothermia did okay. The patients, I'm talking about dogs and cats, were okay after 30 minutes of pneumothermia. That was a dramatic, shift from current thinking that much flow was enough. So it wasn't actually low flow, but they thought it was physiological flow. And what people didn't realize then was that the oxygen that was coming back to the left side, the blood coming back to the left side still had oxygen in it. People thought it was 100% extraction, so you needed that much flow. So this was a dramatic shift and changed cardiac surgery going forward. Now you could see what you were doing. You were in flat over blood. You didn't have to use other lungs. You could use something less. And of course, less blood flow, less blood loss, and less perfusion accidents because people were flowing so high, the pumps were just empty in the middle of the case. This was his diagram. And again, if you look back, there's some question whether he was the one who came up with this principle because the guys in Sweden were already doing this cross-circulation, but they never done it in any human. So who gets credit for what? We don't know. And again, this is stuff that there's no cross-reference, there's no Google, there's no way to check these things. So you just have to accept what the story says. Also, as it was back in the day, we all know the big feud between Cooley and DeBakey when DeBakey went out of town and Cooley did his first case. This was also happening back then. Apparently, Lillehei wanted to do his case, first cross-circulation. Hospital said, wait a minute, this is immoral. You cannot take another human being and use him as a donor. You can't do this. So he waited for the brass to go out of town, and his undying supporter, Wangenstein, he wrote a note on his door saying, can we do this? And he said, sure, go ahead. And of course, the rest is history. So what he did was interesting. It turns out the story says that he had two people helping him in his lab. One of the guys helping him's wife was pregnant. And as they were struggling with ways to come up with perfusion, one of them made a comment saying, wait a minute, what if we could just have a placental circulation for a baby? We're struggling with this. And I said, the light bulb went on and said, of course. If we use a bigger donor and a smaller patient and control the blood flow from the bigger donor to the smaller patient, we can actually flow and get through this. It was the perfect ICU, the perfect chemistry lab. Everything would be filtered and done by the donor, and then the baby would do okay. Sure enough, it worked. He did a lot of surgery, as we all know, and he had the first consistent success using cross-circulation. And moving on with him, he commissioned his partner, DeWall, to come up with a better perfusion system. And actually, DeWall had to force him to change from cross-circulation. Cross-circulation was so successful, why stop? So this is the DeWall system. So blood comes in from here, the bottom, with oxygen. It gets oxygenated, it goes to the top, and then by gravity and the blood comes down, it circles through these helix. Big bubbles rise, the blood gets mixed down at the bottom, and eventually the blood without oxygen, without bubbles, presumably, goes into the patient. You can imagine what the intracranial Doppler and the TE would show today if we did this. We all know that's not true. No bubble, there were still bubbles in there, but it was a revolution and started a new revolution in heart surgery. This is his results. This is Lillehei's results and what was happening back then. He did a lot of surgery that was successful, over 60-something% success, which was better than the zero everybody was getting. This is the first operation using the bubble oxygenator. And in here, in one of these pictures, there's Shamway, there's Barnard. All of these were students of Lillehei, and they all went and studied under him. That was, back in the day, people shared freely and did not claim primacy. If you look at the timeline, so 1952 to 56, hypothermia 70 cases, cross-circulation 45, arterial reservoir 5 cases. And arterial reservoir was basically they get people, adult donors, immerse your arm in water, hot water or warm water for like 45 minutes. So your venous blood gets oxygenated that way. Then you donate the blood and it becomes the source of oxygenated blood for the patient. Dramatic things people did back then. Lung from dogs, 14 cases. And then once the bubble oxygenator was done, cardiac surgery exploded across the world and all over the country. Take another step back. Trendelenburg from Leipzig, we all know about the Trendelenburg position, put him in Trendelenburg, but there's actually a person. And he was famous for doing what? he came up with a trondelmic operation, which was a pulmonary embolectomy. Okay? And back then, people who had PEs, they waited till the patient was pretty much moribund before they took him to the OR and tried to extract the clot. Churchill in MGH, the chief of surgery at MGH, was also, a pioneer of this. Well, he did the operation because everybody shared information back then. Mind you, trondelmic never had any success with any of these patients. I mean, imagine a patient with a massive PE, no pump support, right heart has failed. You take them to the OR the very last minute when they're about to die and open the chest. Zero success. It's reported that Kirshner, one of his students, actually had one success at his institution. Of about 150 cases that were done, the only 9 survivors, which was reviewed by Gibbon. So Churchill, basically, Gibbon, who was a student of Churchill, he was studying the Churchill, not a patient. And this is the quote. Now we'll read it together. It says, a correct diagnosis of massive pulmonary embolism was made, and Dr. Churchill had the patient moved to the operating room where she could be continuously observed and operated upon immediately should her condition become critical. My job in the operating room was to take and record the patient's pulse and respiratory rates and blood pressure every 15 minutes. From 3 p.m. one day to 8 a.m. the next day, the operating room team and I were at the side of the patient. Finally, at 8 a.m., respiration ceased and the blood pressure could not be obtained. Within 6 minutes and 30 seconds, Churchill opened the chest, incised the pulmonary artery, extracted a large pulmonary embolus, and closed the incised wound, the pulmonary artery, with a lateral clamp. I don't know what that clamp is, but during that long night, helplessly watching the patient struggle for her life, as her blood became darker and the veins became more distended, the idea naturally occurred to me that if it were possible to remove continuously some of the blue blood from the patient's swollen veins, put oxygen into the blood, and allow carbon dioxide to escape from it, and then inject continuously the now red blood back to the patient's arteries, we might have saved their life. We would have bypassed the obstructing embolus and performed part of the work of the patient's heart and lungs outside the body. This is 1930. He was thinking about this. So whether he had the idea on his own, but can you imagine, would any of you sit at the bedside from 3 p.m. one day to the next one, 8 a.m., watching the patient slowly die? Unthinkable. It's just unheard of these days. We get away with so much. But that used to be the treatment. That was the trondelmic procedure. You waited till the patient was about to die, then you tried to save him. And it never worked, or it worked very poorly. And so he pursued the idea of trying to get a pump. But he had little funding, no money, working on his own out of his basement of his own, tools that he created. There was no plastic back then, so a very crude instrument, but he did it. And without having money and having subjects, what did he do? He went around Boston grabbing cats, baiting them with tuna fish, and using them as his, subjects. Finally, he got success in 1937, and he describes how he and his wife rejoiced and they danced together. His wife was his assistant. They worked together. And most of the accounts of what he did was actually reported by his wife. Again, we know what his successes were. He had one success, just one success, which, again, was the landmark case that sort of spurred cardiac surgery. That told people that it was possible, even if dangerous. So looking at a few of the pumps, this is the drill in Detroit. He has a pump that looks like a car engine because he had help from GM. That's the pump. He didn't have any oxygenator. So everything, he did right and left side bypasses, not both at the same time ever. He did 4 cases and then quit. Didn't do any more after that. This is a pump by Mustard, which used the rhesus monkey lungs in this chamber here to get oxygenation. This is Gibbon's pump. We showed that earlier. And in steps Kirkland, 1955. So Kirkland, who was across town in Mayo, was obviously, watching what was going on. He was bent on starting his own program. Unfortunately, Gibbon had basically had such poor outcomes that there was very little momentum and enthusiasm for doing anything with heart lung machines at that point. And mind you, Lillyhouse was having great success with cross circulation. So what was the point of starting something else? His institution didn't give him a lot of help, but he persisted. It also didn't help that Dick Varco, who was a very prominent surgeon at the time in Minnesota, gave a scathing report in the Time magazine about how oxygenators were dangerous and impractical. But he persisted. So talking about the giants who did make this possible. Okay. He modified Gibbon's pump to make it a little more practical for their use, and this is his pump called the Mayo-Gibbon heart-lung machine. And to fast forward, this is a disposable oxygenator developed by DeWall, who was working with Lehigh at the time. This is what we have today in pumps. We have a centrifugal pump and a pump. This is the original DeBakey pump, but of course, the modified. This was the DeBakey pump with a raceway with two opposing clamps that pushes blood forward. This works by levitation and magnetic levitation and for propulsion of the blood. So back to where the residents joined the conversation again. Okay, we've talked about the history. We've talked about some of the things that we didn't know and the things that we do know. Now, what happens when you're on pump? What are the ends of going on bypass? We know what the pump is used for. Cardiac, thoracic, and CNS surgeries, tumors, and stuff can be removed safely. You have to provide adequate gas exchange. We talked about how the history of heart surgery was basically stymied by being able to provide adequate gas exchange. Systemic perfusion, if you need to perfuse a patient who's down and cold and just provide support. Temperature control, you can do that with the pump safely. And of course, be able to transfuse patients with blood if needed be. Hypothermia, we use it so frequently, but do we ever think of it as a safety mechanism for us? It decreases oxygen requirements. It's neuroprotective. That's why we cool patients some of the time. It serves as part of a myocardial protection protocol. The colder you are, the less blood flow you need. And of course, for this purpose of this talk, as a margin of safety. What is safe? We know that Kirkland did this in his lab using dogs and showing that as temperature decreases, you have a decrease in metabolic demand of the dogs. And this was instrumental in terms of using flow. If you're cold, 28, you can flow 1.4 liters, 1.6 liters, and the patient will be fine. And this is not set in stone in terms of fixed numbers, but this is something to keep in mind, the residents when you're in the operating room. When you cool a patient and something happens, the first thing your boss or your attendant will say is, how cold is the patient? So your pump breaks and you got to change out the pump. And you're 36 degrees. You're screwed. I mean, you have a minute. So then you start worrying after the whole pump change. The biggest question is the patient going to wake up? Are they going to wake up? Are they going to wake up? If you're 32, you have 5 minutes approximately to be able to change the pump, change the oxygen, whatever you have. So this is part of why we cool. It's not just to cool and make things better for us. So it provides a margin of safety to wait to have a crisis, okay? That's why I said, it's a range. I don't think anybody's done the exact science to figure out how much safety, what the safety margin is. You know, if a different number, I'll be, if it was more or less.
Because we have seen catastrophes that usually takes more than 5 minutes, like make the land and be there.
Oh, I'm sure. That's why I said in the beginning, this is not fixed in time, like in terms of 5, this is just a range. And there's something you got to keep in mind that this is the time that you have, okay? All right. So can any of the residents tell us how you go on bypass? What do you do? What are the things you do?
Basic hypernize. Put your aortic cannula in, put your venous cannula in,
Okay.
and
Checking with TE always the placement of the aortic cannula.
Sorry, TE is not part of
It's not part of it.
Oh, okay.
They were
So
doing
just
bypass
safety
for-
measures, but
As Percy says, 40 years before TE, or 30 years.
Okay.
that's just your basic. Yeah, as long as you have aortic and venous.
What are the basics? I mean, it's more than the basics.
So just to go on bypass your aortic cannula, your venous cannula, and hypernize.
So you put the cannula in and you say go on bypass and that's it, and the surgery commences and everything's okay?
no, first of all, we have to make sure we are hyperinized before putting the cannula. So we have to make sure we have
Okay.
a good ACT before going on bypass. I mean,
So you've given it good, your heparin is fine, everything is fine, what else? You've gone on bypass, what do you do? You just cross-clamp the heart and keep operating?
no.
Okay.
And we have to
Any other volunteers? For-
Drainage.
Check for drainage, okay?
Yeah.
Check your line pressures.
Check your line pressures. What else?
Oxygenation.
Oxygenation,
option.
Cool the patient.
okay. So these are all things you have to do before you say, turn the lungs off, et cetera. So just things to think about.
Just before we continue, so when you go on bypass, basically you look at the color of the lines too, because
Yeah.
it has happened a lot that the surgeon actually say that the arterial line is venous.
It's venous and it's the
Basically
color.
dark, and the oxygen is not connected. Very simple thing that it can, end by a brain dead patient if you don't recognize it quick.
So I put a list of course, not comprehensive, but some of the things to think about when you go on bypass. Patency and continuity, that your lines are still patent. Somebody hasn't left a clamp on the line, because if there's a clamp on an arterial line and you say go on bypass, what happens?
High pressure.
There's-
No, but
Well, after you cannulate, they should check their pressure.
there's no day.
I mean, they, and you as a team should check your pressure. Yeah.
Okay.
You've done this data again, Stephen. You like
You know,
that word.
so you go on bypass and you tell the perfusionist, say, hey, Pervine, go on bypass, and you have a cannula on the arterial line. What happens?
You have what?
Pressure goes very high.
A cannula on the arterial line.
Drain the
A
patient,
clamp.
don't
Yeah,
give the blood
yeah.
back. I mean, the patient can crash, first of all.
Say that again.
You are draining the venous part,
Thank
but
you.
you are not giving the arterial, so the patient can crash.
Okay. So you empty the
much
patient of
more
blood volume. They have nothing.
Exsanguinating the patient
Sure.
without.
But they're not gonna. They is a they correctly. They're not gonna be able to flow. Their alarms are gonna go off in high
Exactly,
pressure.
before the
So it's not
patient
gonna make
crashes.
much of a
Before the
difference
patient
because
crashes.
Steve.
they're not gonna be able to.
Anything can happen from what I said in the beginning. Your pump can fail.
Yeah, the
Anything can happen. Don't rely on an alarm,
Yeah.
because if the alarm doesn't work, your patient is dead.
Well, when you see no red going through,
No.
the aortic is gonna be.
Where do you put the arterial line when you're done? You put it under the drapes, right? And clamp. We all do that. You clamp it under the drapes. You don't see the whole line. It's under everything else because you don't want it to come out, right?
I think
So
it's different techniques for different people.
So let's hear, Stephen, what's your technique?
So I mean, currently I do whatever the attending is, and right now it goes up towards the right shoulder of the patient, and you can see the full arterial line, and then you can see all from.
So
start-
Stephen, let's do the question the other way. You tell the perfusionist you go on bypass, he tells you I cannot go on bypass. Then what is the problem?
So was the arterial line already checked prior, and was they good?
clamped.
Yes, check, everything is checked. Now,
Okay,
you're
so
telling him
good
go on
pressure.
bypass, he said, I can't go on bypass.
Um,
And that happens all the time.
and he can give volume though through the arterial line, correct?
But if it's clamped, he brings a point.
Yes. So sometimes
Right.
the nurse or the
Yeah.
one assisting you is clamping the venous line.
Right.
Is one of your responsibilities to make sure actually
There is no
all the
clamp,
lines
yeah.
are unclamped.
That's
Because
correct.
other people will do it on the table for various reasons, during cannulation and so on.
Yeah, we had a case.
So,
that's correct.
so the first line says patency and continuity between the patient and your pump. Make sure that's patent.
Look
Okay.
everything around and
Yeah. Check all these things. These are visual checks. We do it so effortlessly. We don't think about it because we do it all the time. And those who do it well do it all the time without thinking about it. But it's critical because you can kill a patient without checking all these things. You
And
must.
I think certainly for now, what you say is correct. You should always have both your arterial and venous tubes exposed at some point. You can't cover everything up
Right.
with drapes. Even if you have it covered with drapes at the surgical field, where it goes down, going off the patient, you must have somewhere you can see both the A and B. And once you go on bypass, you just look at them and make sure blood is draining, make sure blood is coming back. You do it once, you're fine for the surgery, but don't cover everything up.
You can have line kinks too. It doesn't have to be like a clamp.
Yeah. So you've checked all these things. You've gone on bypass, or you haven't checked them, and you have a problem. Okay. So before you go on bypass, you go on bypass and you have a problem. One of the biggest feared problems. Okay. Who knows the classic triad of aortic dissection on bypass? I didn't put them in order just for that reason.
No
Venous
pulsatility.
return.
Yeah.
Say it again.
No venous return.
High pressure.
No
High
pulsatility.
line
you
pressure.
won't see the good aortic pressure.
Where are you going to see that?
You are not going to see.
You're
You're going on bypass. You're not going to see any aortic pressure.
The high
I'm
line
sorry, it's
pressure
the-
and hematoma around the cannulation site.
Okay. All right. So
The perfusions will say it's high line pressure.
high line pressure.
I think you just said that.
I have it there. Profound drop in, high line pressure, systemic pressure, no pressure, decreased venous return. And then if you feel a boggy mass in the oblique sinus, you know you're in trouble. That's just when you take a break and come back if you can. But anyway, that's a long day. So these are things you watch for. Now this is a poor swing.
Sorry, who goes feeling the oblique sinus? Is that from like old historical textbooks, or do surgeons actually palpate?
I put as much of that stuff as I found in there, but it's not. People do palpate.
Old school. Dr. Reddy, do you do that?
Posterior-mediastinum.
No, I think with the TE, you don't have to do that.
Yeah, with-
the TE, before the TE, we did.
Yeah,
Old school.
that's, yeah.
So, excuse me, Percy, just to make sure that, because when the aortic cannula is inserted first, we are clamped, we're trying to tie it in place. We always ask the anesthesiologist to take a look with the TE to confirm before, we are gonna connect, but again, it's another way or modality we can use.
Yeah, there's multiple things, and I'll go through a couple of them so we can, interest
If
of
you're in
time.
a hospital that your TEE is not very
No,
good,
I agree with you, but-
anesthesiologist-
Yeah. So of course, TE is helpful, but there are things you can do for TE. When you put the cannula in, you see, so
And most open heart surgery going to a sinus that is done without TE.
without
So
TE,
most hospitals do not have TE on every single case,
yes, absolutely.
at every point in time on demand. A lot of hospitals have TE when you need it. So when you need to interrogate the valve and so on, someone comes in and reads it, a cardiologist, and then leaves. You don't
Exactly.
have them there on
On
demand.
when, you're right, absolutely.
Yeah, classic description is a sudden drop in
Right.
both arterial flow and venous drainage, increase in line pressure, and discoloration of the aorta. Those are the three things that you look for.
Yeah.
And if you see those, you've got to deal with dissection at that point in time. Now, obviously, with the TEE, we confirm with the TEE, and that's made it so much easier.
Has anyone seen an intraoperative dissection on going on bypass?
Sort of once.
Sort of.
Sort of.
Nice.
Have you seen it?
I've seen it, yes, but
Oh, so why was it sort of?
very limited.
No, but the.
Well, the management
The
was,
management was yeah.
Was limited.
Very
was a limited management?
No, the management was, but was appropriately performed.
Was not appropriate.
Was appropriately performed. Yeah, as if it was
So there wasn't a dissection, but
there was a very
so
limited.
it's
very-
All right.
So why is it that aortic dissection is much less common? Like, between all these residents, we must have easily 30 years of experience,
But I think it's.
and none of them have seen it.
So-
Is it that we're safer in how we cannulate? What's different?
Well, we've learned from history, how to do it better, and we know the things. I mean, it's
Canada's are very good as well, I think.
That has nothing to do with it.
It's not cannulate.
Yeah, it's not cannulate,
Affects
yeah.
human beings.
Yeah.
The cannulate.
Yeah.
Believe me, it's nothing to do with the cannulas.
But I think the incidence too, because what is the incidence of aortic dissection?
it's very low. I mean, like I showed in the beginning slide, the incidence of these adverses it's very low.
Yeah, but between all the residents put together, you will have as many thousand cases that somebody should have seen.
I mean, I haven't seen it.
Did you see any in your residency?
I had one, yeah, here.
But how about in your residency?
I didn't have in my.
You didn't see any?
No.
You seen a couple.
One was in with Dr. Corey watching him operate.
Corey.
X-ray
Had a
cannulation
dissection.
dissected.
Yeah, I've done that.
Yeah.
I've gave looking up. We did one some years ago from the axillary and the aortic
doing that
root
case.
dissected.
That's
I've had another one.
Dr. Annie, the old-fashioned surgeons or the old generation, they use that instrument that is tapering down
the old-fashioned surgeons. Dr. Stelzner does that routinely.
I'm not saying
I asked for that
old-fashioned.
instrument. I asked for it yesterday.
No, because there is the first thing.
Old fashioned.
I'm sorry, but I don't. I mean,
It's too late.
this is the first thing was given to me in the hand because I open cannulated all cases of Gerardi and
Don't try to
Kirk
risk it.
and
Just stop talking.
Krieger, and the first thing I was introduced, and
All
he
right.
said,
Okay.
in so many decades you haven't seen it, so that's the instrument, the magic one.
All right. Let's go through a few more slides so we can learn something before the day's over. So
Seriously, Nini, that's actually a good. If you're struggling to get a cannula in,
Yeah.
because part of why we don't get aortic dissection is better technique.
Yeah.
Rather than just keep pushing trying to
yeah.
get your cannula in, take this
Yeah.
historical instrument that you think is bad.
No,
Just
I'm not saying
put
it's
it
bad.
gentle. Believe me, you can get any cannula you want into the patient. What you shouldn't do is to put in an instrument like a,
spread it. Yeah.
like a tonsil or
Like
clamp and
Schmidt.
spread it. That's what you should avoid. take this gentle dilator. You bring it from the museum or from the.
Oh, no. We're mandated to use that.
Oh, from Dr. Stelzistra, he says, just
You have
call
the
him.
lines how deep to go. No.
Seriously though, I mean, the horn dilator went away when we switched from open tip cannulas to closed tip cannulas. When we switched to closed tip cannulas, which most of us use now, they are self-dilating cannulas. That's the reason why we don't use the horn dilator anymore. All of us 25, 30 years ago, we were all trained with the horn dilator. That was a very common instrument at that time. The solid tip cannulas came in the 90s, early 90s, after which you didn't need the dilator anymore because they were self-dilating.
So the message in what you're saying, though, is that you have to dilate your way into the aorta.
Yeah, with the open tip cannulas, which are still used in the third world. So when I go to India, I use an open tip cannula, and then you do have to dilate.
And if whatever cannula you're using is not dilating its way through, then you help yourself with an instrument. But that's the key to what you're saying, is that it has to be a tapered entry into the aorta.
So the other thing, I don't know if anyone still does it. They used to use, maybe Dr. Wynn used it in pediatric or other pediatric surgeons. They used to a C-clamp to cannulate the aorta.
Yeah, that's how Jakob used to cannulate all that.
A lot of people did that in beach.
By many surgeons, friends of mine, I know they do that.
So basically, you make an opening in the lumen in the aorta, and you can see.
I mean, Jakob used to do that all the time, but these were not calcified aorta.
Right.
I think if you do it now, there's so many
He's
patients
got
have
stroke and all that.
aortic disease now.
When I went to Oklahoma in '85, Ron Elkins was doing everything like that. Every aorta was cannulated with a clamp on.
Decannulated with the
And
same clamp.
decannulated with a clamp. I was just appalled.
Yeah.
That's and the problem with self-dilating is that every resident makes a different size hole with a knife. And most of them are too small. They make it too small a hole, put the retrograde cannula in, they make too small a hole, put the aortic cannula in, and that's when you force things. And that's why I teach them to use the horn. And you gotta make a hole that's big enough to get the horn in. But if you just tell them you gotta make a big enough hole to get the cannula in, then they'll make too big a hole. So, make the hole just big enough to get the tip of that horn in, and then dilate it up to exactly how far I can see how far they're dilating. So I know how big the hole is before they try to get
I mean, I use a 15 blade, and you can never make a hole too big with it. Well, I suppose you can just
You can just cut through, yeah.
transect the aorta.
Yeah.
But if you stab it with a 15, it can never be too big.
You can
And
control
it's
it.
big enough to get most cannula in.
Okay, so let's just wrap this up. A few more slides. Now, just go through some of the scenarios. So you've had the dissection. Basically, you confirm that you have a dissection. The treatment, you guys have gone through this with Dr. Reddy in the past, so I won't belabor the point. But you move the cannula somewhere else, cool the patient, and do a repair. We've talked about whether it's a local repair versus an ascending replacement or with a full circuit rest. When you cannulate, we've talked about things. You observe this back flow and prompt action decreases mortality. This is a paper from Leipzig. They looked at a 55,000 cases, talking about incidence. And the incidence was like 0.06 of dissection. But look at the mortality. If you had an intraoperative dissection, that was 35%. So not that many patients, but if you had a dissection, then high mortality. If the dissection was discovered post-op, it was even much more lethal. So it's not without a cause if you have a problem in the operating room. Another paper looking at the type of dissection and where it occurred. If it just involved the ASN, the survival is better. If it involved the arch and descent, then survival is quite poor. If they were able to cool you down before they went on circle rest, your survival was much better. They had a much better survival. If they weren't able to cool, they had to go in emergency circle rest with the patient warm. Very poor outcome, 75% or more mortality with that. You've been on bypass, you've been able to maintain adequate flow, gas flow exchange, you've avoided air embolism at all stages. And this is just to touch back on this. Kirkland reported it in destroying the suit of Senate who came to visit him. So accidents do happen, and it happened back then. And the poor guy was visiting his lab, and the aortic cannula came out, and he ruined his suit and the whole OR. So we've seen this, and we've witnessed it. I've had it happen to me, so it can happen.
Percy, one quick thing, just going back to dissections, there was a very interesting paper from here, from Dr. Greep when he was around. I think they looked at 75 or 80 dissections.
Yeah.
Yeah, and most of them came from the clamp, not from the cannula. And so it's interesting that, you know, I mean, there are various places where you can get the dissection. The flow on the pump is similar. You get similar results on the pump, but it doesn't tell you where the dissection is from. And so very often it's from either the cross clamp or the partial occlusion clamp. Then it can come from the cardiplegia side. but
For
certainly
the coronary anastomosis sites, all these are sites, yeah. They want to.
And Ram, do you think the mortality is as bad as what Percy shows? Because if you have a witnessed dissection,
Yeah,
how
it's
are
again
70%
changed.
of
It's
patients
changed a
dying?
lot. It's changed a lot. I mean, I think that, you know, first of all, there was the whole business of denial, right? I mean, nobody wanted to say they had a dissection. Now the TE tells you, hey, it's
You got a
there.
dissection.
So you can't avoid it.
Actually, it just
I think we move much faster
Yeah.
now than we used to at that time, and so at that time you'd get the entire thing dissected, the head vessel sheared off, everything were done.
just in the interest of time. That was one point that was made in this paper, that if they were recognized on TE, you had a much better outcome. Like, you know, underscoring your point there. Yeah. So if your cannula comes out, you stop the pump, clamp the venous line not to exsanguinate the patient, replace the cannula, make sure there's no air. High pressure lines in OR, this is what a high pressure line normal pressure line should be. Check for dissection, check for dissection, check for dissection.
So Percy, if the patient's already exsanguinated, the reservoir is full of blood and they can't flow, when you stop the pump and do all this, the patient has no blood pressure at all.
So
What do you do?
So you can put the, I was going to get to that on one of the other slides, but basically you can
For the
put
dissection management, I mean?
we-
Management of aortic dissection, because on the next slide,
No, we sort of went a little faster just to get through a few of the things. I could have just stopped there, but so the principle when you have the blood and the venous thing is to basically put the arterial cannula in the atrium.
so you have a patient with an aortic dissection, you take the arterial cannula out and put it in the atrium.
So,
No, you can.
so now the perfusionists, they always have a bridge between the arterial and the venous, and
Yeah.
so they actually can transfuse in the venous.
The venous,
without
yeah.
That you have to translocate the cannula.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have that bridge.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's always in now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's one option. Then,
Big
yeah.
circuit,
Yeah, I
we
didn't know
can.
you did that for everybody.
You don't have
That's
everywhere.
what I was gonna
It's
say.
now.
Yeah, just
It's now in
switch
everyone.
the bridge and pump it
Yeah.
back through the venous. You
Venous
don't
line,
have to
yeah.
remove any cannula.
And also, if any catastrophe happen, you can de-air the lines very quickly,
Quickly,
oxygenate
through the
through
bridge.
that circuit, and then you have a new de-aired line.
Oh,
Versus if you have to recreate it during emergency.
It does introduce one more potential error.
It does, but
If you have a connection like that, you pump things backwards, so you gotta make sure.
it's an extra connection, but I think it gives you safety. So.
Percy, I think each one of these emergencies is very important to go through like carefully, and you know, I know we're running out of time. Maybe we should redo it because
think so,
I think
yeah.
the residents can learn a lot from taking our time with each one. Don't you think?
I completely agree. I mean, I could stop here. That was actually my original plan, was to do the talk in 2 stages. Yeah.
That's a lot about history.
Yeah.
We need to. This is important stuff.
Yeah.
We need to go through the details.
Yeah. Okay. So that's actually a good plan. We'll pick up where we live. Well, we'll start on the dissection and do a better, you know, in detailed discussion about that. Okay. All right.